Jamestown, the first English settlement in America, was established in 1607 in what is now Virginia. The first woman to arrive in Jamestown, known as Ship's Manifest as Mistress Forrest's wife, Thomas Forrest, and a 14-year-old maid, Anne Burris, arrived in late 1608. Also in 1619, 90 young single women from England went to Jamestown to become wives of the men there, with the women being auctioned off for 150 pounds of tobacco each, being to be paid to the shipping company, as that was the cost of each woman's travel to America. Such women were called tobacco brides. 1620, the Mayflower arrived in America. There were 102 people aboard, 19 married women traveling with their husbands, 7 unmarried women traveling with their parents, 3 young unmarried women, 1 girl, and 73 men. 3/4 of the women died in the first few months, while the men were building houses and drinking fresh water. The women were confined to the damp and crowded quarters of the ship. By the time of the first Thanksgiving in autumn 1621, there were only 4 women from the Mayflower left alive. In the 1630s, Anne Hutchinson began to hold religious meetings in her home, which attracted attendance not only of women but of prominent men, including civil officials. Soon later banned from Massachusetts, she had to move to Rhode Island. In 1648, Margaret Brent, an upper-class English immigrant to the colony of Maryland, was the first woman in the English North American colonies to appear before a court of the common law. In 1650, Anne Dudley Bradstreet became America's first published poet, with the publication of her book of poetry entitled The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America. In the small Puritan community of Salem Village, Massachusetts, the Salem witch trials began in 1692. By the end of the trials in 1693, 24 people had died, some in jail, but 19 by hanging and 1 by being pressed to death. In 1656, Lydia Chapman Taft of Upraise, Massachusetts, became the only colonial woman known to vote, casting a vote in the local town hall meeting in place of her deceased husband. Post-Revolutionary War, the idea of Republican motherhood was born in this period and reflects the importance of republicanism as a dominant American ideology. Republicanism assumed that a successful republic rested upon the virtue of its citizen. Thus, women had the central role of enlisting their children with values to a healthy republic. During the Lewis and Clark expedition 1804 to 1806, which was the first overland expedition undertaken by Americans to the Pacific coast and back, Sacagawea was the only woman to accompany the 33 members of the prominent party to the Pacific Ocean and back.
In 1834, textile sales dropped, which in turn forced the wages for women working in these factories to drop as well. This led to a sporadic walkout, however unsuccessful because it only lasted a week and a half and only 1/6 of the women factory workers participated. In October 1836, the women workers in the Lowell, Massachusetts factory mills walked out once again for the same reasons as the strike in 1834. The young women saw the wage cut and the increasing prices of housing board as a direct assault on their social and economic independence, and they wouldn't let the revolting wage cut and rising prices undermine their statues as daughters of freedom. In 1840, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are buried from attending the World Anti-Slavery Convention held in London. This prompts them to hold a women's convention in the U.S. In 1848, the Women's Rights Convention is held in Seneca Falls, New York. After 2 days of discussion and debate, 68 women and 32 men signed a Declaration of Sentiments, which outlines grievances and sets the agenda for women's rights movement. A set of 12 resolutions is adopted calling for equal treatment of women and men under the law and voting rights for women. In 1850, the National Women's Rights Convention takes place in Worcester, Massachusetts, attracting more than 1,000 participants. National conventions are held yearly all the way until 1916, except for 1857. In 1851, the first installment of Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared in the anti-slavery newspaper, The National Era. In years following the Civil Rights War, Stowe campaigned for the expansion of married women's rights, arguing in 1869 that the position of married women is, in many respects, precisely similar to that of the Negro slave. She can make no contract and hold no property. Whatever she inherits or earns becomes at that moment the property her husband. Though he acquire a fortune through her, or though she earn a fortune through her talents, he is the sole master of it, and she cannot draw a penny. In the English common law, a married woman is nothing at all. She passes out of legal existence. In May 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. The primary goal for the organization is to achieve voting rights for women by means of a congressional amendment to the Constitution. In November 1869, Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and others formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. This group focuses exclusively on gaining voting rights for women through amendments to individual state constitutions. On December 10, 1869, the territory of Wyoming passes the first women's suffrage law. The following following year, women began serving on juries in the territory. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. As the movement's mainstream organization, NAWSA wages state-by-state campaigns to obtain voting rights for women. In 1839, Colorado became the first state to adopt an amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. Utah and Idaho follow suit in 1896, Washington State in 1910, California in 1911, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona in 1912, Alaska and Illinois in 1913, Montana and Nevada in 1914, New York in 1917, Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma in 1918, and in 1896, the National Association of Colored Black Women is formed, bringing together more than 100 black women's clubs. Leaders in the Black Women's Club movement include Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Mary Church Terrell, and Anna Julia Cooper. And in 1903, the National Women's Trade Union League, WTUL, is established to advocate the improved wages and working conditions for women.
In 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the Congressional Union to work towards the passage of a federal amendment to give women the right to vote. The group is later renamed the National Women's Party. Members picket the White House and practice other forms of civil disobedience. In 1916, Margaret Sanger opens the first U.S. birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. Although the clinic is shut down, she eventually wins the support through the courts and opens another clinic in New York City, 1923. In 1919, the federal women's suffrage amendment, originally written by Susan B. Anthony, is introduced into Congress. It is passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate. It is then sent to the states for ratification. In 1920, the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor is formed to collect information about women in the workforce and safeguard good working conditions for women. August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, granting women the right to vote, is signed into law. In 1921, Margaret Sanger founds the American Birth Control League, which evolves into the Planned Parenthood Federation of America in 1942. During World War II, over 6 million women took jobs outside the home, including some 216,000 who became enlisted in the armed services. When World War II ended, most women, including those who worked in war plants, returned to highly conventional female roles as wives and mothers, the remarkably prolific mothers of the huge baby boom generation. A cult of domesticity emerged in popular culture. 1950 television shows like Ozzie and Harriet or Leave It to Beaver depicted ideal suburban families where the mother was always shown only working in the home. However, during the 1950s period of economic prosperity, a surge in white-collar employment opened special opportunities for women. They became the principal beneficiaries of clerical and service work, creating an extensive pink-collar ghetto of occupations that came to be dominated by women. Exploding economic opportunities for women unleashed a groundswell of social and physiological shocks that were unleashed in the next decade. In the 1960s, a feminist trend emerged in the United States, encouraged by significant feminist studies such as The Feminist Mystique by Betty Friedan, and by a general legislative climate favorable to minority rights and anti-discrimination movements. The women's liberation movement, which was social rather than political, was manifested in literature and demonstrations by radical feminists. Those feminists raised the awareness of the nation to the prevalence of discriminatory beliefs and attitudes towards women at the time. More significantly, feminist political organizations arose that developed into full feminist movements by the 1970s. These included the National Organization for Women, or NOW. Now brought to bear on the major issue of ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, to the Constitution. The ERA was approved by the U.S. House of Representatives in 1971 and by the Senate in 1972. In 1982, however, the ratification of the ERA fell 3 states short of the needed 38. Later, congressional efforts to reintroduce the measure have failed, although a number of states have added equal rights clauses to their constitutions. Since the 1980s, the women's movement has focused on diverse issues, including the reproductive rights, preserving the women's right of choice to have an abortion against the fervent pro-life movement, sexual harassment, and the so-called glass ceiling that impedes women in corporate advancement.